Welcome to Oil and Gas Law with Energy Law Prof. We're talking about unitization. Now, as a reminder, unitization is different from pooling because pooling is about getting land together for a single well, whereas unitization is about getting together multiple wells and often many landowners, maybe dozens of landowners, to operate a single oil field or oil reservoir together in the most efficient manner. So often, as we'll see, it involves not only shutting in some wells, but maybe turning other wells into injection wells to send down water or gas to squeeze out the last remaining oil in a property. Now, as we've talked about in class before, in the United States, this unitization process is typically taking place after landowners have been producing oil and gas, each on their own property, for quite some time. In the international context, unitization might happen before anybody drills a single well. You would have the companies come together, figure out exactly where the oil and gas is located, and develop a plan to operate it together most efficiently. But in the U.S. context, typically the exploration of that field and that reservoir happens under the rules we've already talked about. Those rules about well spacing, those rules about allowable production, those rules about where you can drill and pooling, etc. And so over time, you learn about the reservoir based on where oil was found and where oil wasn't found. But after some period of time, eventually that reservoir will start to produce less and less, and all the different parties on that reservoir might decide it might make more sense for them to operate their wells in a common plan to maximize production. Now, the big challenge with doing this is you have to come to some kind of agreement about how the oil and gas that's produced under that common plan will be shared. And it's not always possible to reach some agreement. So think about just this very simple oil and gas reservoir and how you might agree to split it up. So first, it's always important to remember that the default that each of these parties will concern, and you can see we've got three parties, A, B, and C, is that they will be thinking about what will I be able to produce if I just keep pumping oil under the regular conservation rules, allowable limits, etc. that I'm subject to. And what you can see is if these parties just keep pumping, probably at some point enough oil will be gone that B will continue to produce oil, but A and C will be cut off from any further oil production, whence the oil is limited to just the top of that reservoir. So the backline assumption of these parties is for B, well, I'll be able to keep producing, but for A and C, they might think, well, if we just keep producing under the field rules, eventually I won't be able to produce anything. Now, why would B be willing to negotiate with A and C on a more efficient way to produce this reservoir if the default is basically that B gets to keep producing longer than either party? Well, the basic reason is that once A and C, those wells, water out, it may be good for B for those two parties to start shooting water down their wells so that it helps squeeze out the last remaining oil to B's well. And that means B may get more oil production, may not have to pump as hard. So there may be room for an agreement. But I think to understand whether there will be an agreement, the first thing you have to think about is how much will these parties be able to produce if they just keep operating under the normal field rules until they water out, their well has to be shut in or stopped, in other words, and the entire reservoir is depleted. Okay, now that is an example with a very simple reservoir. I want to take us back to an only slightly more complex reservoir, but it's one we looked at in the previous class. And this is a reservoir that has both a natural gas cap on top and a water drive on the bottom. So you see that gas cap, which is squeezing the oil down, and you see that aquifer below pushing the oil up. And we talked about before, what's the probably optimal way for this reservoir to be operated? Well, imagine that it's owned by 6 different parties. In that case, they're going to just keep producing as much as they can under the conservation rules until all the oil and gas is gone. But what would likely be more efficient is for wells like this one that's only producing water, or wells like this one that's producing a mix of oil and water, to instead just inject water down, and that water, when it reaches the bottom, will help squeeze oil out to the wells that are producing oil. Okay, so those 2 wells should produce more. And in fact, it probably makes sense to turn that gas well into an injection well as well, to send down more gas to help that gas cap push the oil out to those 2 wells that are actually producing oil. But keep in mind, even in this relatively simplified, stylized example, still a little bit complicated. We've got some wells shooting down water, we have other wells shooting down gas, and at the end of the day, if what you were left with was all the oil, or as much as you could, produced, you would still be left with that gas cap, which might then be worth producing. So the wells that had injected gas might now produce gas. So there are a lot of ways that over time, this entire field could be operated to maximize overall production. Now, if they do that, if they unitize this reservoir so it's operated together, they're going to have some way of determining how much of the oil and gas that's produced should be shared with each party. And again, the background assumption that they're going to take into those negotiations is how much am I going to be allowed to produce if I just keep running under the default conservation rules until this reservoir is depleted. And keep in mind that well 2 here and well 5 are likely to be less likely to want to give up much oil, because if the background conservation rules say that you can only produce if you're basically mostly producing oil, then maybe they're the only 2 wells that get to produce. On the other hand, maybe it would be easier to reach a deal if the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission allowed these wells that were producing natural gas to keep producing as well. So in that circumstance, they might say, well, I'll just keep producing, and it might be that well 2 and 5 have to offer them a share to get them to stop producing. So I think what's important to understand is going into those negotiations, a lot is going to depend on what the conservation rules are that are set by the conservation agency, because that is going to determine what your best alternative to a unitization agreement is. If you've taken a negotiations class, you may have called that a BATNA, best alternative to negotiated agreement. So that's going to determine what kind of deal can be reached between these parties to operate this reservoir most efficiently. Let's take a look at an actual case of unitization. Baumgartner versus Gulf Oil Co. This is a Nebraska case from 1969. It's on page 793 in your 8th edition textbook. This is a field that was unitized for water flooding. So it's a little bit simpler than that last example, a little bit like the example before that, where we just have water being used to flush the oil out of the reservoir. The plaintiff declined to join the unit. So there are many parties here that agreed to operate this reservoir as a unit, but the plaintiff did not. And we will see that there's different ways to form a unit. In Texas, there's no forced unitization, so it has to be by agreement of the parties. In other states, there often is the ability for the conservation agency to force unitization. But in this case, in Nebraska, the conservation agency didn't do that. Instead, most of the parties came together and agreed to operate the field as a unit. The plaintiff, however, did not. So the plaintiff declines to join the unit. As a result, his land was excluded from the unit. The reason the plaintiff perhaps declined to join the unit is he thought, well, when the water is used to flush down the oil, there will be a time when that oil is swept beneath my land. And if I can drill a well during that time, I can extract that oil as it goes by. I can take advantage of the water flooding that the people that agreed to the unit are doing. And he proposed exactly that kind of well, and he's told the Conservation Commission it could have made about a $12,000 profit. As we'll see, it would have produced about $90,000 of oil, but it would have cost about $78,000 to drill. So the idea, according to his expert, is that it would have produced a $12,000 profit. Now, to give you a little picture of how this looks, just go ahead and take a look in your book on page 795, where you have this picture. And what I want you to note here is the plaintiff's small tract, which is right here. And you can see it just contains a corner of the reservoir. Now, you can see that to operate this reservoir as a unit, there were wells up in the north side and in the south side, as well as one here on the east that were converted to injection wells, where water would be injected to push oil from all these directions toward the center of the unit to be produced. But the plaintiff thought, you know what? As that oil is passing by my land, I can drill a well and it will produce $90,000 of oil. I'll make a $12,000 profit. And so rather than join the unit, I'm going to ask the Conservation Commission to drill that well. Well, the Conservation Commission didn't allow him to drill that well, said you can't just take advantage of this unit that everybody else agreed to operate this efficiently. And as a result, because the plaintiff's well wasn't approved, that $90,000 of oil was swept first onto the plaintiff's land and then off of it to the center and produced by other parties. So the plaintiff sues. And the plaintiff's argument is this is a trespass, because this isn't, the normal case where, yes, some oil and gas was sucked off by a well that was on my neighbor's land. Instead, you actually physically flooded water beneath my property, and that water came underneath my property and pushed the oil off. So that's a trespass. The district court agreed with that, and they said, well, the rule for trespass is that they have to give you all the oil back, so you get the full $90,000. In this case, the majority said, no. This isn't a technical trespass. We don't apply those technical trespass rules to something that's happening so far beneath the earth and is intended to maximize production of oil and gas. Maybe it's a little bit like that airplane flying overhead. Look, we have to have a modern economy. Yes, I know that in theory we said you own to the heavens, but that plane is allowed to fly overhead. And by the same token, somebody's allowed to use water to sweep out oil to the center of the reservoir under this unitization agreement. Now, I want you to note that that makes this case very similar to a case from Texas, 1962, similar time period, that says this. This is a famous quote. If, to prevent waste, protect correlative rights, or in the exercise of its other powers, the Commission authorizes secondary recovery projects, a trespass does not occur when the injected secondary recovery forces move across lease lines. The technical rules of trespass have no place in the consideration of the validity of the orders of the Railroad Commission. So in Nebraska, as in Texas, a water flood under an agreed unitization scheme does not count as a trespass. All right. Now, I want you to go back to this idea. So the parties can agree to unitization. As I've described, there are some places where that can be done by order of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, even if the parties don't agree. But in that case in Nebraska, and even today in Texas, there are places where, like Texas, it has to be voluntary. So if you were trying to negotiate a voluntary agreement in this situation, how much would each party get? Well, those negotiations are going to be very difficult, and you're not always going to be able to come to agreement. Why would it be difficult? Well, let's think about this picture, but then think about some of the reasons that parties would have different positions and different incentives. So first, every reservoir is different. So that means that one reservoir might have the same permeability throughout. Some might be thicker in some places and thinner in other places. We talked about that during that Pickens case that we covered earlier in the course. Every party is different, and they may have different incentives, they may have different goals, and they may have different theories of the reservoir. Every lease can be different, and that can create different incentives for the different oil and gas companies, lessees operating, and for the different lessors, the landowners. There can be lots of different theories of fairness. So as we said, often the bottom line that the parties are going to be entering with is how much oil would I get if I don't agree to a unitization agreement? But there's other theories of how the oil and gas should be shared. What about the theory, hey, I actually have more oil and gas under my land. Shouldn't I be allowed to recover that? Think of that party in the middle on that diagram where it had gas directly under its property, so maybe it would get shut in. So maybe if it doesn't agree to unitization, it won't get much. On the other hand, there's a whole bunch of oil beneath that gas. So shouldn't it get a fair amount of the oil and gas that's under its property? Isn't that the point of the conservation laws? So there are different theories of how much each party should get, and all of those theories depend on variables that we maybe don't know at the time that we have to agree to unitization. Because I've shown you very pretty pictures of exactly where the oil and gas is, but in reality, we don't know exactly where they are. And I've tried to make you think about what those parties expect to happen if there is no agreement, but in fact, they don't exactly know what the future would be, how long they're going to be able to produce oil and gas in the location where their well is, and what future rules there might be from the conservation agencies that might change their ability to produce oil and gas. So let's go in depth on these a little bit. Every reservoir is different. Every reservoir has different porosity, how much oil and gas can fit in it, different thickness, we talked about that, different permeability, ability for oil and gas to flow through it and be produced. So those different kinds of variety in reservoirs can have a huge impact on how much oil and gas can be produced from any property. And one thing that is difficult to know until all the wells are finished is how long each different area of the reservoir will produce and each different landowner's well will produce. Also, every reservoir may have certain areas where even if there's not as much reservoir there, it might be more efficient to produce from it because the geometry of the reservoir makes it easier to shift oil to that region to be produced. Now, secondly, every party is different. Now, some may have been producing for quite some time. Should the parties that haven't been producing as long get some kind of bonus for the fact that other parties had a head start? Or should the parties that had a head start be advantaged because they've been operating further, would, if nothing is agreed, end up with a larger share of the reservoir? Another big challenge is that sometimes the parties have different levels of knowledge about the reservoir, about where exactly the oil is located, etc. And sometimes, even if they have the same knowledge, you might worry that your neighbor knows more about the reservoir. And so if he or she is offering you a deal, does that suggest it's a bad deal? And really, if you didn't agree, you would end up with more oil and gas. Some parties have different percentages of interest. So this can apply, of course, to oil and gas companies that may owe different royalties on their different properties. There could be different interests in existing facilities. So, some parties may have interest in a couple wells that will continue to operate. Others may have interest in wells that will have to be turned into injection wells. As we described, there can be very different theories of the reservoir between each parties, and this is one of the big challenges. If you have been sharing a reservoir with your neighbors for years, there may have been lots of conflicts. There may have been lots of arguments. There may have been legal conflicts about how much each party should be producing, and you may suspect that your neighbor has been harming your interest in some way. So when you're now expected to come together with that neighbor and agree on a plan to operate the reservoir together, it can be very challenging. Every lease can be different. So some leases, and many leases, will give the oil and gas company the authority to negotiate unitization. But it's possible that a lease might not give the oil and gas company that authority, or might limit that authority, which could make it difficult to negotiate. And it might mean you have to have negotiations between not just oil and gas companies, but between landowners as well. Oil and gas companies may be under different obligations with different land to drill more wells, to continue operating wells, to produce on each part of a property, and those can affect whether they can agree to a more efficient plan to develop the reservoir. There could be very different royalty terms between the different wells, and that can affect whether the oil and gas companies are willing to agree to a unitization plan. One thing that happens a lot of times is that landowners and oil and gas companies may have different incentives in terms of how much expense is taken to get that last oil and gas out of the ground. From the perspective of the landowner, more production is good because the landowner gets a royalty share. So just a share of production no matter how much it costs. The oil and gas company, on the other hand, the lessee has to pay those costs. And so the lessee is wondering, is it even worth it to drill this extra well to produce this last bit of oil and gas? So when the parties are negotiating a unitization plan, they have to think about whether they're going to give credit for work already done. If one party did a study of the reservoir and is now sharing it with everyone so you can come up with a unitization plan, are they going to be credited for that and given a bigger share of oil and gas? How do they split the remaining costs? If more work on exploring the reservoir is needed, or more work on developing an engineering plan to produce the oil and gas, who pays for it? They have to think about how to pay for costs that may benefit not just the parties to the unit, but other parties as well. If there's a pipeline built that's going to carry oil not just from this field, but from other fields, how is that paid for? And then finally, the big thing they have to consider is how is all the production going to be allocated? Another important thing that you have to think about with unitization, and it's interesting why this is important, is whether you're going to have a redetermination process and whether that's worth it. So if you are coming to an agreement about unitization on a very big reservoir with potentially a lot of oil left, you may want to agree to a redetermination, which is that after some period of time, you are going to go back and determine if really the parties should have received slightly different shares of production. And one common reason for that is that the premises that you entered the unitization plan on were a little bit off. And in fact, one area of the reservoir produced longer than expected, and another area of the reservoir produced shorter than expected. And does that suggest that you should true up those divisions, those allocations of who got the oil and gas based on that? Because remember, the idea was that every party wants to end up better off than if they just continued producing their oil and gas reservoir without stopping until it was depleted. And over time, as you learn more about the reservoir under the unitization plan, you may realize, oh no, I agreed to a bad deal. Now, a redetermination process might true that up for you and say, oops, there was more oil than expected on your land. We are going to give you a bigger share. So the advantage of the redetermination process is that it might make you more willing to sign on to a unitization agreement to begin with, because it basically says, don't worry, if it turns out our assumptions were wrong, or maybe somebody didn't tell you what they should have about the reservoir, this will all be trued up in the future. The big disadvantage of redeterminations is, of course, they cost money and they reopen things that you thought you agreed on. So it's important to decide whether you want a redetermination process. It can make parties more likely to agree. But if you want it, how often do you want to do it? When do you want to do it? How much do you want to spend on it? Another thing that parties, of course, think about are tax consequences. They may have different preferences for when oil and gas is received, when they receive revenue versus when they make expenses based on their taxes. Those kind of considerations, very important to oil and gas companies, but they are outside the scope of this course. The last thing I want you to think about unitization is that even in places where technically there is no forced unitization, or even if the Conservation Commission says, technically I am not going to force unitize this field, the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission or the Railroad Commission can have a big impact on whether in fact those parties want to agree to unitization. They can have an impact in a lot of ways. One way we already talked about is because the Conservation Commission, the Railroad Commission in Texas, they decide how much each party can produce under its allowables and when it will have to be shut in because it's producing too much gas or too much water. And so that can determine the parties' incentives to come to an agreement. There's also a case in your book where the Conservation Commission just said, hey, everybody is going to produce less until you all come to an agreement. So there are a lot of subtle ways that the different conservation commissions can encourage those parties to agree to unitize their field for more efficient production.